Located along the banks of the Estero River is the Koreshan Unity Settlement at Koreshan State Park. Although the landscape and many of the buildings remain the same, the people who lived here have all vanished. This is the story of the Koreshans, Estero's urban pioneers who moved to Southwest Florida from Chicago at the turn of the 20th century and lived here until the early 1980s. After the end of the Civil War, many Americans were traumatized over thousands of lives that were lost and families torn apart by its destruction. People began questioning traditional religions and were longing for a better way of life. During this time, it wasn't unusual to find new religions popping up, formed by self-proclaimed demagogues and reformers of Christianity.
Scientific advances were just going crazy, and people's faith was challenged by that. They didn't know how to reconcile religion and science. And here comes this guy, Cyrus Teed, who promised to bridge those in a very comforting way. He had all the answers. And he had what he called a religio science.
Cyrus Teed was born in 1839 near Trout Creek in Delaware County, New York. He grew up listening to sermons delivered by his grandfather, who was a Baptist preacher.
Teed showed at an early age that he had a gift of oratory, and he would seem destined to follow his grandfather Tuttle. However, he decided to study medicine. And Dr. Teed graduated from the Eclectic Medical College of the City of New York in 1868.
As an eclectic doctor, he disagreed with many mainstream medical practices and strongly believed in the ability of the brain to heal the body. According to Cyrus Teed's personal account, he was working in his laboratory one evening when he blacked out and had a transcendental religious experience. Cyrus Teed claimed an angel appeared and told him he was chosen to redeem the human race. His description of the angel was that of a beautiful woman, and she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Teed identified himself as the man-child, the ruler, the new Messiah, who changed his name to Koresh, the Hebrew translation of Cyrus, and founded a new faith called Koreshanity.
Cyrus Teed had what he called his divine illumination when he was 30 years old. And as part of that divine illumination, he saw God as both male and female combined. So from that point on, Cyrus Teed saw women and men as equals on earth. So in other words, in 1869 in Cyrus Teed's world, women were equal to men.
Teed claimed that this vision is what started the formation of the principles of Koreshanity.
Cyrus Teed wanted disciples. He was going to form a communal socialist society where everyone gave up their worldly possessions. Everyone was celibate in order to achieve immortality. You also needed to believe that the world was hollow. This was called his theory of cellular cosmogony, and that we lived inside of a hollow earth.
According to the theory of cellular cosmogony, all the universe existed inside the earth instead of outside. The sun was suspended in the middle and had a dark side, and a light side that let off a beacon of light. It rotated on its own axis every 24 hours, causing daytime and nighttime. Teed spent 16 years lecturing across the state of New York, trying to grow a congregation. He continued to practice medicine to support his wife Fidelia and son Douglas. At this point, all he managed to build was a commune in Moravia, New York, with only 11 people. His wife, sadly, became very ill, and he would soon become a widower. Eventually, his luck began to change. In September of 1886, Dr. Teed accepted an invitation to address a convention of the National Association of Mental Science in Chicago.
Reports were that Cyrus Teed was a big hit before the Mental Scientist Convention, so much so that they elected him president of their group. He stayed in Chicago afterwards, giving lectures on the ability of the brain to heal the body, charging $12 for the course. Finally, his new religion was gaining some recognition.
Over the next few years, Cyrus Teed was able to build up his congregation, mostly from upper-class backgrounds. He started publishing a monthly magazine, The Goddard Star, with his teachings. In 1887, Teed met Mrs. Annie G. Ordway, later renamed Victoria Gracia. He would never marry her, but upon his death, he claimed they would fuse into one human being. Until then, she would help him rule as the first woman president of the Koreshan unity. Teed decided to consolidate his followers by moving them to Chicago to join the other Koreshans, living in a larger, more upscale mansion they called Beth Ophrah.
At one point, 80% of Koreshans were women. It was tough to be a woman in the 1880s and 1890s. You were completely dependent on men. If you left your husband, you could lose your children, and you might not have a place to go. So here comes Cyrus Teed. He supposedly knew answers to things that you're conflicted about. He's offering you shared childcare and a way out of the whole marriage thing. He knew that treating women as equal and giving them equity was pretty darn attractive.
Teed began receiving death threats. Almost everywhere the Koreshans lived, their religious beliefs and practices were not tolerated.
Teed went a step further and said that wives should leave their husbands and join his organization. Well, this didn't sit well with husbands whose wives did leave them, and there were two $100,000 lawsuits for what was called alienation of affection. These lawsuits attracted the attention of the Chicago Tribune and other newspapers in the area, and soon it was sensationalized that Teed was the wife stealer, taking men's wives for purposes that were unknown. And I think this was the turning point when the people of Chicago turned against Cyrus Teed.
Cyrus Teed, Koresh or Master as his followers called him, had already been searching for the New Jerusalem with enough land for millions of his disciples to join him. As fate had it, the Koreshans were able to settle in Estero, Florida after purchasing 300 acres of undeveloped land for a very low price of $200. That was supposedly the amount needed to pay for back taxes. They had convinced the landowner Gustav Domkohler, a widower and homesteader originally from Germany, to join their commune. Abiding by their rules, he turned over most of his property for free, with the exception of 20 acres that was reserved for his son. Domkohler's house, that's still standing today, was the only one on the property.
The small group that arrived here in 1894 were sent ahead to clear the land and plant crops. Life was pretty hard. They had to face the elements, including rain, mosquitoes, and the heat.
By 1903, a new influx of Koreshan settlers increased the population to more than 200. A building boom started, signaling the beginning of the Koreshan unity's golden years. In an area with almost no manufacturing or commerce, the Koreshans started close to 30 businesses. Among them was a sawmill to cut their own lumber, a boatworks business used for building and servicing vessels for the local citrus industry. They generated electricity, selling it to outside customers, and operated a very busy publishing company. Their bakery made up to 500 loaves of bread a day, enough to feed all the Koreshans plus provide bread to their general store. Their original store was built in the early 1900s, right on the riverfront. The new general store was constructed much later, in 1920, along the Tamiami Trail, the first road connecting Miami and Tampa. It was the only store between Naples and Fort Myers. Koreshan living quarters were constructed, separating males and females.
Teed required that devout Koreshans practice celibacy. He felt that especially for women, marriage was slavery. Women often joined the Koreshan unity without their husbands, and if they brought children with them, they were separated from their own children. Teed wanted to break the family tie. This is why he got the reputation as a dangerous cult leader.
The Koreshan dining hall was 3 stories. It was the tallest building in Lee County. Education was very important to the Koreshans. They learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, along with a trade to help keep the settlement going. Adults were also encouraged to attend school to learn a trade. Women were able to learn non-traditional jobs and held important leadership roles in the settlement. Cyrus Teed had appointed 7 women to what he called the Planetary Court to manage the Koreshan unity's business affairs. They lived in a special building and each member had their own spacious bedroom. Culture was also a vital aspect of Koreshan life. There would be public festivals celebrating Teed's and Victoria's birthdays, as the Solar and Lunar Festival. The art hall was built to hold indoor exhibits, plays, and concerts. The Koreshan Orchestra was one of the first in all of Florida. Many Koreshan hymns used tunes that already existed, changing the lyrics to align with the Koreshan message. It wasn't unusual for Koresh to take ideas from others without giving them credit.
In 1906, Cyrus Teed decided to get into politics. The Koreshans would all vote as a large voting bloc. They would vote for the same candidate or referendum. The Koreshans were all registered as Democrats, but 2 years earlier they had all voted for Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican candidate for president. Lee County's Democratic Party wasn't happy about that, so they decided to disqualify all the votes cast by the Koreshans in their primaries. This prompted the Koreshans to start their own political party, the Progressive Liberty Party, and also a newspaper, the American Eagle, with articles supporting their views.
Adding to even more animosity, the Koreshan Unity had incorporated 110 square miles of their land in Estero into a city. Cyrus Teed felt this entitled them to a larger portion of the county road taxes, taking away money from all the other people in the county. Tensions were running high.
So the upshot was that the Koreshans had some guests coming into town. And ahead of time, they called the hotel in downtown Fort Myers and they asked whether the guests had arrived. There was some sort of miscommunication on the phone, and the guy who owned the hotel ended up thinking that the Koreshans had called his wife a liar. So the guests do come into town, and the Koreshans come to meet them, and there comes to be a little fight in the street, which becomes much bigger.
You call my wife a liar?
And the marshal gets involved. Cyrus Teed happens to be in town and decides to go over to see what's happening. And there's now a huge brawl in the streets. Teed has his glasses knocked off, he's struck several times in the head and carted off to jail. There are two different reports as to what caused the fight. One in the local paper saying that Teed came out swinging, and one in the Koreshan newspaper, the American Eagle, saying that Teed actually went over to calm things down. Teed had always said he was a martyr and he predicted his own death. And so the Koreshans had this neat narrative that these injuries caused his death 2 years later.
During his final days, Cyrus Teed isolated himself in the founder's house. He suffered unbearable pain. He moved from the founder's house to a house on Fort Myers Beach, where he passed away on December 22, 1908. Newspapers across the country reported that Teed's body was not rising. His followers were worried, so they put Teed in a zinc bathtub, hoping he'd reanimate. But instead, he began to decompose. 5 days later, the health department ordered Teed to be buried. So a tomb was built above the sand to keep Teed's body safe while waiting for him to resurrect. The tomb was destroyed in a hurricane in 1921. For a while, those most loyal to Koreshanity did stick around, and it was business as usual. They continued inviting the public to trade goods and share their creativity. Among the locals who stopped by were some of Southwest Florida's most famous winter residents, Thomas and Mina Edison and Henry Ford.
There are lots of parallels between why Thomas Edison and his wife Mina came to Southwest Florida and why the Koreshans settled here. You know, they were both interested in the climate here. They were kind of the original snowbirds to Southwest Florida. They loved the flora, the fauna, the fishing, all of those things. And Edison called Florida his peninsular Eden. So he even has kind of spiritual overtones to why he wants to come to Florida. Henry Ford had a little bit of a deeper connection and interest with the Koreshan Unity settlement. He asked questions about them. They gave him an entire set of their religious documents for him to view. He also told the newspaper that he believed in reincarnation. And later in his life, he becomes even more interested in that when his son Edsel passes away.
Ford was also impressed with the Koreshans' technological advancements.
It became obvious that Cyrus Teed's reincarnation might never occur, and a strong, charismatic leader like Teed may never emerge to take his place.
Hedwig Mitchell, a new recruit, arrived at the Koreshan Unity in 1941. The population had dwindled down to mostly 35 elderly people, and the settlement was in disrepair. Hedwig was a Jewish woman forced to flee Nazi Germany to escape persecution. She was close to 50 and already skilled in business matters. She motivated the original members, by then in their 70s and 80s, to rebuild and revitalize their most profitable enterprises. But her biggest accomplishment was yet to come. In March of 1944, she took over management of the planetary court while old members kept dying off. A decade later, Hedwig learned she was eligible to receive reparations from Germany for the damage done to her and her family during World War II. That gave her the money needed to lobby Florida's governor, Ferris Bryant, to establish the Koreshan settlement as a state park. In 1961, that dream became a reality.
The Florida Park Service is committed to preserving the memory of the Koreshan unity, not just through buildings, but also through their ideas, their writings, and their photographs to keep their memory alive.
And that's what you see here today, traces of the past, some of them obvious, while others are more subtle, often shared by the descendants of the Koreshan unity. Descendants like Scott Ritter, who visits the Koreshan settlement with his family quite often. Scott's great-grandmother, Rose Gilbert, was a member of the planetary court. She remained a Koreshan her entire life, while his grandfather, Dean Gilbert, left the commune at 19. He moved to New York, became a successful banker, and went on to raise a family. Scott had the opportunity to personally speak with Hedwig Mitchell, who was one of the last living members of the Koreshan faith.
We would have conversations about the future. I think she had a pretty good idea that the religion itself wasn't going to survive. The fact that she lived here alone and watched the place come apart was a reason that drove her determination to see it come back together in some shape or form.
Another family proud of their heritage are the descendants of the McCready family. Their grandmother, Marie McCready, came to the Koreshan unity with her parents and 4 siblings when she was a child. Years later, she published detailed memoirs of her life growing up as a Koreshan and her departure from the faith at age 17. Marie's grandchildren discovered her photo album in their father's attic with historic images of Koreshan life and donated it to the park's archives.
Our grandmother was a very intelligent, independent, interesting lady who was a very positive role model for all of us.
Their great-grandparents, Abigail and William McCready, the settlement's beekeeper, kept faithful to Koreshanity and lived in Estero until the day they died.
The Koreshans were incredibly industrious, and they lived at a time where they still thought utopia was possible.
They thought this was going to be a city with millions of people, and they wanted to be here at the start of a new era of humanity.
They were determined, visionary folks who wanted to build a better world right here where I'm sitting.
They thought they could harness the Earth's energy and that they would live forever.